The jungle loomed like a living entity, thick with fog and dread, pulsing with the residual energy of war. Beneath its dense canopies and bioluminescent vines, a lone human soldier staggered forward. His armor was scorched and fractured, every breath drawn with ragged desperation. Mud clung to his legs like the dead hands of fallen comrades, and the stench of decay followed him through the trees. Around him, the forest whispered in frequencies beyond the range of comfort. Somewhere just beyond the veil of branches, something ancient stirred. Azura was not Earth. It did not comfort. It did not forgive. And it certainly did not forget. For years, humanity had fought a losing war against the Kareth, an alien species born of genetic elegance and strategic cruelty. The battles were asymmetrical. Where humans relied on desperation and brute force, the Kareth wove probability and precision like silk. They descended not like storms, but like verdicts final and impossible to evade. But today it wasn't just another battlefront. Today had weight. The soldier didn't know why, only that he'd been separated from his unit after a failed extraction, and that someone or something was still hunting him. His tactical display was dead. Comms were silent. GPS scrambled. The only rhythm he had left was his pulse thudding against his eardrums like a drumbeat marking the approach of something unseeable. They said the Kareth had commanders who weren't entirely organic anymore. Beings who transcended the divide between mind and machine logic and lore. And among them, there was one known only by her title, Saraxa, the Red Spear of the Void. She had no rank, no record in the conventional sense. But every soldier knew her silhouette, tall serpentine grace wrapped in adaptive armor etched with runes that shimmered like a second skin. She was not spoken of in reports. She was whispered about during power outages and last rites. And now he could feel her. The shadows grew thicker the deeper he moved. The flora vibrated at inaudible frequencies, petals opening and closing in reaction to his movement. There were no birds on Azura, no mammals. Only silence and bioorganic surveillance. He ducked behind a massive moss-covered root and tried to steady his breath. But the jungle knew. And so did she. A presence emerged from the canopy like a shift in gravity. She didn't descend so much as arrive. The world bent slightly toward her like metal drawn to a magnetic center. Saraxa was everything the rumors said. She was radiant, lethal, composed. Her armor wasn't armor at all, but a living system that rippled across her body like liquid metal reacting to thought before action. Her eyes, the color of pressurized gold, locked onto him like an equation long awaited. The soldier rose to his feet, not out of courage, but because something in her gaze demanded verticality. She stood still, studying him with the intensity of a sculptor assessing a cracked block of marble. He expected execution. What came instead was containment. Without a word, her guards emerged from the shadows. 3 Kareth enforcers, silent and identical, their weapons not aimed to kill, but to preserve. His rifle was stripped from his hand by a magnetic pulse clattering to the forest floor like discarded logic. Resistance, it seemed, was no longer part of the algorithm. They didn't bind him. They didn't need to. She turned, and he followed. What began then was not captivity, but procession. They moved as a unit through the underbrush, past vines that recoiled at their passing and spores that shifted hue in the heat signature of their presence. Saraxa led the way, never once glancing back to see if he obeyed. She didn't have to. She already knew that he would. Her movement was a kind of meditation, flawless steps that found balance even on ground that shifted beneath their feet. The guards moved in sync with her while he stumbled and bled and breathed like a creature still tethered to the old laws of survival. He didn't know what she wanted, only that she wanted something. Her silence was not absence, but deliberation. Every glance, every subtle change in posture hinted at a calculus unfolding in her mind. He was not a prisoner in the traditional sense. He was a variable, unknown, possibly valuable, possibly doomed. Then came the rupture. Without warning, the jungle screamed. From the earth erupted creatures he had only glimpsed in reconnaissance images. Archrid swarm beasts, local apex predators, biologically weaponized by centuries of mutation. They came not in hunting lines but in crescendo's limbs, flashing with chitin and fury. The Kareth guards responded with practiced precision shields, activating mid-air weapons, slicing through exoskeletons with clean arcs of plasma. Saraxa did not retreat. She stepped forward. and he, the broken human, moved with her. Not out of honor, not out of strategy, out of something stranger, a compulsion older than language. He threw himself in the path of one of the beasts, intercepting a strike meant for her. The blow grazed him not fatally, but enough to send them both crashing into the undergrowth. Pain flared up his spine, but he registered it only dimly. They rolled together in dirt and leaves, her armored hand against his chest, her eyes wide, not with fear, but something disturbingly close to recognition. They survived. Barely. The guards regrouped. The swarm fell back. But something fundamental had changed. Saraxa now watched him differently. Where before he had been a curiosity, now he was a paradox. A human who saved the Kyrith's most feared commander. Not for diplomacy, not for gain, but because his nervous system responded faster than his brain. The forest knew it, the guards knew it, and Saraxa knew it most of all. They continued toward the extraction point in silence, and yet that silence was thick with unfolding meaning. Her movements grew more deliberate, her presence closer. The guards widened their formation not to contain him, but to give space. When they reached the cliffside overlooking the extraction vessel, a Kyrith cruiser shaped like a blade of obsidian cutting through the mist, he knew escape was no longer on the table. He would enter that ship. He would sit within its walls. And whatever he had become, object, asset, or anomaly, would not be erased. It would be examined. He walked up the ramp, flanked by silence, entered the cruiser, whose walls pulsed with the heartbeat of alien technology, and understood something in that moment that would outlive him. She was not taking him as a prisoner. She was taking him as a possibility. Inside the Kyrith cruiser, everything pulsed with intention. The walls were not inert panels, but living conduits veined with currents of light that flowed like arterial rivers through the ship's metallic anatomy. The very air trembled in cadence with the engine's frequency, as if every molecule had agreed to hold its breath for her. Saraxa moved through its corridors like memory through a neural net, not leading, not following, simply belonging. He followed in silence, each footstep a violation of symmetry. The guards walked beside him, not with menace, but with certainty. There would be no escape, not because he was chained, but because the ship itself would not permit it. Every threshold scanned his biosignature. Every passing node registered his pulse. He had become data in a system far more intricate than any human algorithm. They reached a chamber at the heart of the vessel, circular and windowless, where the floor responded to her presence by illuminating an interface array mid-air. Lines of shifting script glowed softly unreadable to him, dancing between time-locked constellations and combat statistics layered in abstract geometry. Saraxa stepped into the center. The room responded as though welcoming a queen returned from exile. She gestured and the holographic field expanded, revealing a map riddled with red markers and spectral distortions, evidence of disruption, incursion, mutation. The Arcrid ambush had not been random. Something in the planet's biome was shifting. Something unknown even to the Kyrith. And yet she focused not on the anomalies, but on him. He stood near the edge of the room. Posture, rigid, mind, alert. His injuries from the skirmish ached but did not deter him. Adrenaline had long since drained away, leaving him in a state of detached awareness. The kind of clarity that came only in the aftermath of chaos. A clarity that allowed for reflection even in the presence of the enemy. But Saraxa did not see him as an enemy, not anymore. She studied him as the maps dissolved into fractals of theory and speculation. Her golden eyes, once cold, now brimmed with calculation of a different kind. What she saw in him was not weakness, not threat, but possibility. Something intangible had been unlocked when he had thrown himself into harm's way to protect her. It had not been logic that moved him. It had not been survival. It had been something deeper, older, an instinct that defied the programming of war. In Kyrith thought philosophy, this was called the disjunction, the moment when variables exceed control and birth new constants. She had sought this, not through diplomacy, not through coercion, through confrontation. And somehow this human had stumbled into the eye of her hypothesis. But the system had detected the deviation. As the cruiser accelerated into upper orbit, alarms began to echo in distant parts of the vessel. Status symbols flickered red. Saraxa's posture shifted, still calm, but sharpened. Her guards moved to their stations with fluid synchronization. A secondary Kyrith vessel had begun pursuit, but it bore not the insignia of allegiance. It bore the crest of dissent. They were not hunting humans. They were hunting her. She knew this moment would come. There had always been those within her species who believed her path was heresy, that seeking parity with an enemy was betrayal, that absorbing contradiction was dilution. But she had persisted. And now they had come to silence her deviation. The soldier watched as Saraxa initiated evasive maneuvers, guiding the cruiser through planetary rings and dense meteor clouds with terrifying precision. The ship groaned under the strain, but it obeyed her like a beast that feared only one master. He held onto a nearby strut as gravitational compensation fluctuated the metal beneath his hands, warm, almost pulsing. Through the viewport, starlight stretched into streaks. They dove into the debris field of a broken orbital minefield, ancient remnants from an older war. The pursuing vessel hesitated, slower, heavier. Saraxa wove her ship between the fragments with impossible grace. The soldier realized with reluctant awe that she was not merely escaping. She was leading them. Moments later, the trap revealed itself. Ahead loomed a fortress station, silent and dark until now. It had slumbered in the void, forgotten by most except her. As the enemy closed in, the station awoke. Beams of light lanced from its surface, slicing into the pursuers with ruthless efficiency. Fire bloomed in vacuum. Fragments spun off into oblivion. The dissident ship was reduced to wreckage in moments. Saraxa allowed herself no celebration. She recalibrated systems, restored balance, then turned her attention back to him. He had watched her wage war as though it were music, precise, fierce, beautiful. And now she watched him as though waiting for him to understand why she had shown it. She didn't want compliance. She wanted comprehension. They docked at the fortress station, a hollowed-out monolith of Kareth architecture, its walls carved with purpose. Inside, they walked without guards. There were no threats here, only ghosts of decisions made and consequences inherited. He followed her into a hall lined with historical memory cells, slabs of light where Kareth commanders passed, spoke in looped echoes, every word archived, every defeat recorded not as shame, but as learning. She paused at one, a general who had refused to negotiate with human envoys. His arrogance had led to the glassing of 3 Kareth moons. The memory ended in silence. She walked on. At the center of the station was a chamber unlike the rest. Not tactical, not scientific, something closer to ceremonial. She stood before a crystalline node that resonated faintly with energy. She placed her hand against it, and it bloomed outward, revealing not maps, not data, but possibility. Within the projection was a model, 2 galaxies coalescing, not in collision, but in synchronization. 2 life systems learning to adapt, hybridize, evolve. The model played out scenarios: cultural exchange, cohabitation, war cessation, political transformation. At the heart of the model, one single human stood at a convergence point. She turned her eyes to him. The implication was clear. He was not chosen, he was discovered. And now she was asking him to accept that discovery, to inhabit the possibility she had theorized and gambled everything on. A bridge between what should not have been bridgeable. He stood motionless, blood drying in his collar spine, burning with the residue of battle, and realized that he was standing not in the ruins of conflict, but in the foundations of something unthinkable. Not victory, not defeat. Union. The thought struck with the weight of collision and the softness of inevitability. A Kareth and a human enemies by design, now staring into the breach of history as potential co-authors of something that defied every directive they had ever known. She offered no command. She offered no promise, only the future. The fortress became a crucible. Time lost its habitual rhythm as decisions began to calcify into patterns. What began as an improbable rescue evolved into a deliberate convergence of 2 opposing vectors, human defiance and Kareth precision. And at the center of this convergence stood a man who was no longer merely a soldier and a commander, who was no longer simply an adversary. In the days that followed their arrival at the station, the silence between them turned from tense to taut, no longer vacant, but saturated with observation analysis and the building architecture of something emergent. The human adapted to the rhythms of Kareth technology, its pulse-driven systems, and thought-activated interfaces. He moved through hallways carved by artificial intelligence older than his species' recorded history. Sensors tracked his movements not as intrusions, but as accepted variations. He was no longer a virus in the code. He was a mutation being welcomed. Saraxa worked without rest. Her plans expanded beyond the war. She convened with her inner circle commanders born in the core systems, engineers molded from the solar mantles of Kareth homeworlds, and philosophers encoded with millennia of judgment. Many objected. Some did so openly. A few left the station without permission. They did not return. But Saraxa remained unshaken. The human had become not her prisoner, not her experiment, but her partner in strategy. His presence disrupted traditional protocols, and in that disruption she saw advantage. His insights, unrefined, instinctive, sometimes erratic, cut across the smooth lines of Kareth logic like a blade through silk. Where her kind overanalyzed, he acted. Where they predicted, he improvised. His tactical intuitions were not flawless, but they were alive. And more than once, that aliveness revealed gaps in enemy formations, flaws in decades-old doctrines and paths through stalemates thought permanent. Together, they began testing the limits of joint command. Small missions at first, reconnaissance drones co-designed with human unpredictability and Kareth optimization, communication codes that blended linguistic structure from both civilizations, combat simulations where mixed species squads operated in unison. Then came the anomaly. An outer colony orbiting a dying star sent a signal distorted by interference, its contents fragmented but urgent. A bioweapon non-aligned, neither Kareth nor human, had surfaced within a rift canyon spanning the equator of a long-dead moon. Both sides had sent scouts. None had returned. Whatever it was, it fed not on matter, but on will. Saraxa made the decision to investigate it directly. She did not delegate. She brought the human with her, not as a hostage nor as a symbol, but as an extension of her own perception. They descended in a carrier designed for atmospheric chaos, its hull bristling with reactive plating. The moon below was a graveyard of broken geometry, shattered installations, twisted monoliths of once advanced settlements, now eaten away by entropy and ash. The landscape pulsed with unseen tension. Their arrival disrupted nothing. The silence had teeth. The rift awaited. They crossed the thresholds on foot, escorted by an elite Kareth detachment, augmented with adaptive armor and neural synchronizers. At the center of the rift, the atmosphere bent. Time seemed to pulse backward and forward like a wave dragging memory from bone. And then it emerged. The entity had no name. It had form, but only intermittently. It borrowed light, borrowed logic, borrowed hostility. It fed on conflict and bloomed in the presence of contradiction. It mirrored the thoughts of those who approached it, weaponizing ideology as easily as radiation. Kareth's shields faltered first. Their certainty became their downfall. The entity fed on patterns, absorbed prediction. But the human mind, chaotic and unscripted, resisted. He stepped forward. Saraxa did not stop him. Where Kareth tech overcalculated and failed, he improvised. He moved not with knowledge, but with instinct, not with control, but with willingness. The entity recoiled. It could not metabolize uncertainty. It could not digest anomaly. His presence fractured its feedback loop, forcing it into entropy. Saraxa struck the final blow not with weapons, but with synchronization. She aligned her neural field with his for a single blinding instant. The resonance collapsed the entity inward. It died without sound. What remained was not peace, but pause. In the aftermath, Saraxa stood motionless, eyes closed, every atom recalibrating to the reality that her theory, once ridiculed, once branded as sedition, had proven itself not in treaty, but in battle. The human, bloodied but unbroken, understood nothing of her internal reckoning. And yet, he had stood with her not for her, and that distinction mattered more than she had anticipated. When they returned to the station, the structure responded to them differently. The lights shimmered warmer. The pathways adjusted to their joint pace. The AI interfaces no longer separated command inputs by species. The system had recognized their fusion. Word spread, not just to Kareth territories, but through intercepted human channels as well. Rumors fragmented at first, then increasingly corroborated a commander and a soldier enemies, once now operating in tandem, defeating what neither species could alone. Factions formed. Across both civilizations, voices rose, some in support, some in horror. Old dogmas were disturbed. ideological borders strained, but something irreversible had begun. Saraxa called a council not of Kareth alone, but of joint envoys. The soldier attended not as decoration, but as strategist. The table was circular. The agenda was unscripted. They spoke not of surrender, not of peace agreements, but of merger. Not colonization, not assimilation merger. The word rippled like tectonics. Some walked out, some stayed, and a few, the most dangerous of all, smiled without comment. That night, the human walked the station's outer deck stars, spinning silently beyond the transparent dome. The Kareth sky held different constellations, but his breath fogged against the cold glass just the same. Behind him, Saraxa stood still watching. Their future was no longer a question of possibility. It had become a matter of endurance. The alignment had begun. The momentum of convergence could not remain untouched. As with all unions born in the shadow of war, resistance incubated in the spaces where silence once reigned. At first, the ripples were subtle, a failed communication relay here, an unexplained delay there. But beneath the surface of newfound coordination, deeper structures began to crack. The fragility of the alliance did not lie in the bond between the soldier and Saraxa. It lay in the fault lines their union revealed across two civilizations unequipped to reconcile what they symbolized. Kareth High Command fractured quietly without public decree. Some units went dark, others disobeyed field orders. Entire fleets broke away from orbital rotations and vanished into deep space corridors known only to long-dead navigators. Internal AI systems flagged anomalies in loyalty matrices. Saraxa read the patterns as easily as she had once read troop formations. These were not isolated acts. This was a forming schism. Her existence had become heresy to those bound by ancestral codes. On the human side, political dissent moved faster. Footage of her and the soldier surfaced on leaked communication channels, blurred captures of joint missions, energy signatures linking their neural fields, brief flashes of their silhouettes moving side by side through battlefield fog. Within days, Earth's interim war council denounced the soldier as compromised. His designation was stripped, his records locked. He had become a ghost among his own. Still, he did not waver, nor did she. Their work continued now in shadow. They adjusted strategy, restructured command networks, hardened defenses. But they did not hide. Saraxa refused to let ideology bully innovation. She spoke to her commanders with unshakable calm. She reminded them that survival was not the same as stagnation. That victory, once the Kareth's singular obsession, had blinded them to renewal. She did not ask for belief. She demanded vision. And still the war returned. It came not from enemy borders, but from within. A Kareth strike vessel presumed loyal turned its weapons inward during a joint operation in the Alkenis corridor. 4 human scouts died. 2 Kareth emissaries followed. The message was clear: the rebellion had shed its mask. It no longer feared consequence. The station prepared for siege. The soldier no longer moved as an outsider. He had memorized the station's breath, its oxygen flux rhythms, the shifts in corridor gravity, the stutter of the heating vents before they rebooted. He knew where the Kareth favored stillness and where humans would have spoken. He had learned to read their emotions not through expression, but through micro-tensions in posture, neural temperature variance, the subtle tremors that came before action. He stood in the command chamber beside Saraxa as final logistics were processed. She did not speak to him, but he knew her mind was already split between offense and defense, between external threat and internal alignment. And somewhere buried beneath that calculation, he sensed it, that current of conflict too intimate to be categorized. Fear not for her survival, but for the fragility of what they were building. The attack came in stages. First, communication blackout. All external nodes silenced. Then, environmental destabilization ventilation reversed in key subsections, lighting rigged to blind infrared receptors, pressure systems toggled in erratic cycles. The assault was engineered not just to harm, but to confuse, to separate instinct from instruction. Sabotage, not invasion. Then the breach. Not through docking bays, but through core maintenance shafts rerouted by compromised station AIs. The enemy wasn't an outside fleet, it was a splinter unit of Kareth tacticians and human radicals acting in violent harmony. Their coordination mirrored the Alliance, but in reverse. They came not to disrupt the station, They came to erase it. Saraxa led the counteraction herself, armor reconfigured around her body like a closing thought. She moved through the battlefield not as a figurehead but as a force. Her commands were issued through pulse code neural bursts that linked her to every loyal operative on the station. The soldier fought not by her side, but in parallel tracking infiltrators, through sensory overlays, setting traps in collapsed corridors, manually overriding hacked ventilation arrays to trap and suffocate their adversaries. But for every cell extinguished, another emerged. The enemy had anticipated more than strategy. They had anticipated fatigue. Fatigue of those who had already fought too long and lost too much. And somewhere amidst the chaos, the soldier felt it, the whisper of exhaustion, pulling at the seams of his resolve. The knowing that even rightness when isolated can feel like madness. Then came the fracture point. A reactor substation collapsed under explosive pressure. The entire northern quadrant of the station lost life support. Saraxa had been routing energy shielding from there. The collapse severed her link to the core command network. She was cut off, alone. The soldier found her moments later. She stood in a corridor thick with fire suppression mist. Her armor-singed eyes unfocused. Her neural interface flickered erratically, blood at the corner of her mouth. Not defeat, just pause. For the first time, her symmetry faltered. He stepped forward without hesitation, carried her not as a comrade but as a cornerstone, guided her back to the heart of the station through fire, through collapsing architecture, through her own doubts. She did not speak. He did not need her to. The station lit their path in low amber, acknowledging adapting. The moment they reached the core node, something shifted. The station's primary intelligence, ancient even by Kareth standards, re-engaged full activation. It recognized the convergence of their signatures. It evaluated the threat. And then against every encoded protocol in its memory, it rewrote its operating parameters. It recognized them not as an anomaly, but as its new directive. The station reawakened. Countermeasures deployed. The invaders were expunged, not slaughtered. Disarmed, neutralized, confined. The system had learned from them, learned from the alliance they had tried to destroy. Hours later, as silence fell and the dead were counted, Saraxa stood on the observation platform, the soldier beside her. Behind them, rebuilding had begun. Ahead of them, the future waited, bleeding, imperfect but intact. They had survived the fracture, but now they would have to survive what came after it. The war did not end with a treaty. It ended with exhaustion. It ended not with applause nor pageantry, but with the quiet realignment of purpose in those who had grown tired of the perpetual loop of conquest and retaliation. The alliance forged between Saraxa and the human soldier did not dissolve in the wake of battle. It solidified, hardened like cooled metal shaped by pressure and heat and left to settle into something functional, permanent, undeniable. The rebellion had not been entirely crushed. Its remnants scattered across systems, hollowing into exiled colonies and coded networks. But its momentum was broken. Its mythology had failed. The symbol it tried to erase, the convergence of enemy and enemy into ally and then into something deeper, could not be undone. The station was not abandoned. It became something new. Neither a military base nor a neutral territory, but a seed point, a crucible for what could come next. Saraxa relinquished her title as the Red Spear. She shed her armor as a final act of conviction, not because she had surrendered, but because she no longer required a symbol. Her authority no longer came from fear. It came from continuity. The soldier, nameless in every registry that mattered, did not return to Earth. The species he had once fought for now viewed him as a paradox, a liability, an uncomfortable mirror. But among the Kareth, he had become a variable woven into their logic. The station accepted his biometrics. The AI learned his thought rhythms. When he walked its halls, the walls pulsed a degree warmer. In time, others came, not as armies, but as emissaries. Engineers from both species who spoke in hybrid blueprints. Historians who documented not just battles, but transitions. Linguists who began the work of crafting a new syntactic interface where Kareth structural resonance and human improvisational tone could merge. It was not always harmonious. There were months of silence, moments of mistrust, accidents, disagreements, quiet nights, when even Saraxa stared into the void and wondered if she had misread the current. But through it all, the soldier remained, not as her echo, not as her shield, but as her reference point. Where she anchored strategy, he challenged outcome. Where she protected legacy, he provoked evolution. And eventually they stopped sleeping in separate quarters. The station shifted around them. Their bond, once disruptive, became foundational. It altered diplomatic protocols, redirected resource routes, restructured the command hierarchies of the old Kareth war clusters. Where once hierarchy flowed in perfect symmetry, now it flexed. Where once chain of command was rigid, now it pulsed. Together, they built something that no single name could contain. A sovereign network, a hybrid civilization, a new construct of identity that refused to be labeled human or Kareth, but instead born of both and bound to neither. Years passed, not in peace but in movement, in learning, in recalibration. Children were born, not many but enough. Some by blood, others by oath. They did not resemble their parents in form, but they carried the imprint of their defiance. They learned to navigate the station's ever-growing corridor system like neural pathways forming memories where others had mapped only function. The twins were first one born with her silence, the other with his fire. They moved through the station's orbiting gardens like concepts unburdened by context. Their presence reminded even the most skeptical minds that the improbable was not only real, but now routine. Siraxa aged slowly as Kareth do. The soldier aged faster but not tragically. Augmentations and biotech extended his years, though he wore them without vanity. Time softened neither of them, but it clarified their lines. Their history could no longer be separated from the future. In the evenings when systems dimmed and the station shifted to low hums, they would sit in the observatory, the twin stars of Azura dancing beyond the transparent hull. They did not speak often. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer absence. It was presence built from shared blood, shared vision, shared disobedience of everything they had been told was immutable. Sometimes the soldier would trace the outline of the war memorial etched into the station floor. It held no names, only frequencies. The neural echoes of those who had chosen fusion over fracture. The signal could be played if one wished. But mostly it remained dormant, pulsing like a second heartbeat beneath the station's foundations. And when the question came, as it always did, about what they had built, how they had done it, Siraxa would answer the same way every time. They had not obeyed. They had not surrendered. They had not compromised. They had aligned, and in doing so, they had authored a future that had never once appeared in any algorithm. Not a truce, not a ceasefire, a beginning. And so their legacy lived on, not as legend, but as blueprint. A reminder that the line between enemy and ally is thinner than fear wants us to believe, and that even in the cold vacuum between stars, connection remains the most powerful force in the universe. Thank you for joining us on this journey beyond species, beyond war, and into the fragile, defiant heart of possibility. If you found this story meaningful, consider supporting the channel by subscribing. Your support helps us continue crafting narratives that challenge, inspire, and transport you to places where the unimaginable becomes inevitable. Subscribe now to explore more stories like this where borders blur and futures are forged.